My book, it's about how I met, fell in love with, and married the man of my dreams, only to find out about 2 years into our marriage that he's transgender. There were times when I really did struggle. I've been a reporter for more than 20 years. As such, I've covered more than my share of tragedies, terrorist attacks of September 11th while working in the New York City suburbs. I've covered homicides. In those cases, you're telling somebody else's story. In this case, I was telling my own. That made it much more difficult.
This podcast is part of the Blueberry Network, where listeners and podcasters come together. Find out more at blueberrywithnoease.com.
The Eat Sleep Right podcast is brought to you by generous grant from the Built on Dreams Media Network, with additional funding by the Sims Media Foundation, and from the generosity of listeners like you.
Stand by, please. Rolling on 6. On 6.
Welcome to episode 40. If you enjoy the Eat Sleep Right podcast, or if you had your own success in writing, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me about yourself and your story, and I may get back to you and have you as a guest on the Eat Sleep Right podcast. If you have any questions or comments, anything at all, please write me. The email address is comments@eatsleepright.net. Thanks for leaving me a short message about the podcast. I really do appreciate it. Once again, the email address is comments@eatsleepright.net. Alexandra Bogdanovich, welcome to the Eat Sleep Right podcast. It's wonderful having you with me today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You classify your work as memoir autobiography. Can you explain the differences? Are they related, or are they completely separate, or are they completely intertwined?
That's a good question. It's something that there's been a lot of debate about in literary circles. I prefer the term memoir. I say that because this particular book is not about my entire life. It's only about a portion of my life.
When you say it pertains to your life, are you saying it figuratively as your writing life or more on a personal level?
This is more on a personal level. It actually sums up about 20 years of my life in 50,000 words or so, give or take. It's an average amount of words, including a little bit of extraneous detail, so some people might say it's too many.
The book is titled, Truth Be Told, Adam Becomes Audrey. Tell me a little bit about the book.
It's about my relationship with the men that I eventually fell in love with and married. About how 2 years into our marriage, found out that he is actually transgender. I also share what happened after I learned the truth.
This must have been one heck of a shock for you.
That's putting it mildly. My whole entire life was literally turned upside down. Everything I thought I knew, everything I thought I wanted, everything I thought I was going to have was based on deception.
How did you find out?
Interestingly, I did not find out directly from my husband. I found out from his psychiatrist. He'd been seeing someone who specialized in gender dysphoria. He actually took me to see her, and she told me the truth.
When did you find out your husband was transgender?
We were married in August of 1997. I found out in September of 1999.
When did you first start writing the book? 2 years ago?
No, I actually started writing the book in 2009. It was published in August of 2012.
Did you ask him why he never said anything?
One of the first questions out of my mouth after I stopped crying was why he never told me. The answer to that at the time was that I was the person he loved the most, and he was most terrified about how I would react.
He should have been terrified. You have an overwhelming amount of emotion built up inside of you during this entire learning process. How do you take your feelings and put them into words? Was it difficult to do? Did the words come pouring out of you, or did you have to really struggle with this just to get it on paper?
There were times when I really did struggle. I've been a reporter for more than 20 years. As such, I've covered more than my share of tragedies, terrorist attacks of September 11th while working in the New York City suburbs. I've covered homicides. In those cases, you're telling somebody else's story. In this case, I was telling my own. That made it much more difficult. It took more than 2 years to complete the writing process.
After you finished the 2-year writing process, you came out a much stronger woman.
Absolutely. The whole writing process was an incredibly difficult yet healing, cathartic process. I hope by sharing my story, it'll give others in similar situations strength as well.
What makes your book different from others of the same genre?
The thing that makes my book unique, it's written from my perspective. A lot of members of the LGBT community come forward either through mainstream media, or they write books, or go on television to share their stories, and that's incredibly courageous. But we very seldom hear how those experiences affected their friends and family. I think those stories are just as important. And I also think that just because someone isn't a celebrity or a high-profile person, it doesn't make their story any less important. I wanted to give those people a voice.
What was the hardest thing about promoting your book?
Believe it or not, the hardest thing has been deciding whether or not to do it. I wrote this book mainly to help people, to share a different perspective on an oft-told story. But at the same time, I'm a fairly private person. It's a sensitive topic. I didn't want to exploit my own life, so to speak.
Writing such intimate details as you've done, was it hard to step back and look at things in the larger picture?
There were a lot of points where I could have done that. Actually, because of my journalism background, I did feel compelled to tell the whole story and not to limit it simply to my perspective. To do that, I first turned to my now ex-husband, asked whether he wanted to participate. The answer to that was no. It was a very firm no. I then turned to the internet, to proponents and advocates in the transgender community, detailed a portion of the book to things I learned from them and statistics that hopefully will shed some light on the overall experience in the transgender community.
What made you want to be a writer in the first place?
I think it was something I was literally born to do. I remember being in the 4th grade. We had to write a short story, a short fictional story. I wrote a story based on a role-playing game that was popular at the time. My story had a quest. It had a beginning, middle, and end the way it was supposed to. It also had a twist. Evil won. Evil triumphed at the end of my story, which was classic good versus evil. I let the bad guys win. Pretty much knew I wanted to be a reporter at age 12. Got my first byline in a daily newspaper when I was 14. The rest is history.
Complete this sentence. A writer's inner journey is
insanely difficult. I think anyone who thinks writing is easy is fooling themselves. The best way to see how difficult it is to try it themselves.
When you wrote the book, being filled with such a high degree of emotion, what was the writing process like for you?
Interesting. At the time, I had a very demanding day job with a paper in Virginia. The last thing I wanted to do was come home and write, especially after a grueling deadline. I'd try to write at least 5,000 to 10,000 words a day. Mostly I used a technique called block writing. Just wrote whatever came to mind and worried about cleaning it up later. That was the bulk of the process.
What's the nicest thing anybody ever said about your book?
They heard my voice in it. One of the highest compliments a writer can be paid.
Why did you write the book?
I didn't write it to exploit anybody. I didn't write it to hurt anybody. I didn't write it to out anybody. I did it solely to help people. by sharing my experience to reinforce the idea that no matter what people hear or see in the mainstream media, they need to remind themselves that there's always another side to the story, whether that story is frequently heard or not.
How did you manage to persevere and get through the whole experience?
There were days when I would just sit and cry for hours. There were days when I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to do it anymore. And those were the days when my friends, my closest friends, were at their best in terms of pushing me to continue doing it. There were times when I wondered why I was doing it at all and I wanted to quit. It was just too hard. I was reliving every aspect of what had happened.
Anything in the pipeline you can give us some tidbits about?
I do. I'm planning on writing at least 2 more books. I'll begin the research for my second in about a month or so. That one will be based on my father's life as a political refugee and staunch anti-communist in post-World War II Europe.
After all this upheaval, how are you doing today?
That depends on the day. Today I'm fine. I'm a lot better than I used to be, but it's like anything else. Whenever you have some kind of trauma in your life, no matter what it is, divorce or recovery from addiction or mental illness or alcoholism or whatever the case may be, you always have to take it day by day. It sounds cliche, but it's true.
How traumatized were you? Just how really traumatized were you when you found out?
It's very difficult to describe. I couldn't stop crying. I was literally physically sick for at least a day. I couldn't believe the betrayal. It's hard. It's hard to explain. Picture your whole entire reality as you know it being just shattered. Every single thing you think you knew and wanted and expected to have in your life, you all of a sudden find out that you can't have it. You're not going to have it, at least not with the person that you thought you were going to have those things with. And that person that you loved so much and so deeply has so fundamentally betrayed you. I was traumatized. I had a lot of very good close friends who listened to me yell and scream and vent, put up with a lot of drama, gave me the strength to move on. I don't think you ever get over something like this, but you have to learn how to deal with it.
How about an excerpt from your book?
I didn't want to tell anyone about my past, much less anything about Adam. After all, I'd come to Virginia to put it behind me and start a new life. Nevertheless, curiosity abounded. People wondered what brought a single young woman from the New York City suburbs to Warrenton, of all places. I told them a bit gruffly that I needed a change of scenery, and that I had left everything I'd ever known to join the staff of what had once been one of the best suburban newspapers in the country. I never imagined the first person I'd confide in would be a high-ranking cop. Yet somehow, even though we'd only known each other for a few months, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I could trust Major Paul F. Mercer, Jr. I got married at a horse show, at the Hampton Classic Horse Show, one of the most prestigious shows on the East Coast, I told him, on what promised to be a typically hot and humid June day. It was a fairy tale wedding. We got married on the Grand Prix field. We had a horse-drawn carriage, 75 invited guests, and 3,000 spectators. Oh, and it was on TV, I added, almost as an afterthought. Traffic on Route 50 crawled past the Upperville Horse Show grounds and then came to an abrupt halt behind a motorist who wanted to turn into the wrong gate. Major Mercer stepped off the grassy shoulder to talk to her and quickly pointed the wayward driver in the correct direction. "So what happened?" he asked when he returned to his cruiser. "What?" I said. "You were saying that you had this fairy tale wedding. Apparently things didn't work out. What happened?" I wanted to tell him. I just didn't know how. Sitting on the ground behind his black Ford Crown Victoria, I began pulling up blades of grass. One by one, I let them slip through my fingers.
Where can listeners learn more about you, your book, and your stories on the internet?
The book is available on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. It's also available at my official author website,